Bob. I'm delighted to be here and have a chance to talk to you a little bit about some of the research that I've been doing at the MIT Center for Digital Business. We've heard this morning about some of the amazing things that the technology is doing to change our everyday lives and some of the things that are happening going forward. What I want to talk about today is about how networking and information technologies are affecting what I think is the most important single economic statistic, which is productivity, and as well as driving innovation. Productivity, what is productivity? Productivity is simple to define. It's just output divided by input. And ultimately, productivity, although it's not everything, I think in the long run it's almost everything, at least to economists. Productivity is what determines the wealth of nations. It's what determines the competitive success of companies. And it's what determines all of our living standards and those of our children and grandchildren. If productivity grows at say, 1% per year, it takes 70 years for living standards to double. But if it grows at 4% per year, it'll only take about 17 years for living standards to double. And after 70 years, it'll be 16 times higher. So productivity is a key driver of economic growth. Growth does not really come from people working harder or more hours. It doesn't come from using more resources. It comes from people combining existing inputs in a more effective way to create more value. In turn, where does productivity come from? Well, productivity comes from new technologies and new innovations. Of course, the most important technology of our generation are networking and information technologies. And as we'll show, they are really the key to driving our productivity and our living standards today. But perhaps even more interestingly and more importantly, I'll show that information technology is driving an increase in our ability to innovate, changes the way that we can innovate ourselves. And that is leading us not just to a higher level of productivity and living standards, but to a faster rate of growth. So first, let me just show you a little bit of data about what's happening with productivity. And many people see that the economy, isn't doing so well, we're struggling. But what you may be surprised to know is that actually the past 10 years have been among the best ever in productivity growth. The past 10 years had more productivity growth than the go-go 1990s and more than the 80s or 70s. So it has not been a bad era of productivity growth. We're actually creating a lot of value. Trillions of dollars of wealth have been created. But of course, productivity, output per unit input, has two parts to it. There's the denominator. Part of that is that we're creating more wealth, but part of it also is that not as many people are working as before. And I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of my talk and how some of the issues that arise from rapid technological progress. Because there's no economic law, unfortunately, that everybody needs to benefit evenly from technological progress. It's quite possible to create a lot of wealth and have that very unevenly distributed. And that, as you can imagine, is exactly what's been happening in the past decade or so. Now, a big driver of this productivity growth has, in fact, been remarkable improvements in information technology. We've seen rapid declines in the cost of computer equipment relative to all other kinds of equipment and inputs in the U.S. economy, orders of magnitude improvement. We've seen rapid increases in investment in those areas. You see a little bit of a blip there in the late 1990s of a bubble and a crash, but the long-term trend, that's just a small blip in a longer-term trend of rapidly increased computer power that people have. And it's even more rapid if you measure it in real terms, not nominal terms. So not how much we're spending on computers, but the actual amount of computer power being delivered, of course, is growing even faster. You take the dollars spent and multiply it by the fact that each dollar is buying more and more. Microprocessors are more powerful now. Memory is cheaper. Storage is cheaper. Communications is more effective. So that leads to a rapid shift in the kinds of inputs available to managers and entrepreneurs. The relative costs of information processing and networking equipment are much lower, and they're much more powerful relative to other kinds of inputs, relative to energy, structures, other kinds of equipment, even labor. And so rationally, you'd expect people to shift around the kinds of inputs that they're using in production, and that's one of the things that we're seeing. Now, this has translated into a very measurable improvement in productivity, and a lot of my research has been around measuring the productivity effects of information technology. And rather than just give you the numbers, I thought I'd sort of flash a little bit of the raw data up here. So this is a scatter plot of firms in the U.S. economy, all the publicly traded firms in the U.S. economy, and we have how much IT investment they have, their IT capital stock on the horizontal axis, and we have the vertical axis is their productivity, accounting for not just the labor input, but in this case also capital, energy, materials, all the other measured inputs we could have. And there are a couple of things that are worth noting here. First is that there's a slight upward slope there. What that means is that on average, companies that are more IT intensive tend to be more productive, and that's statistically significant. That's a very important phenomenon. That's part of what's driving this growth in productivity that I just showed you on some of the earlier slides. But I want to show it you this way as well, because you can see there's a tremendous amount of variation there. There's not a one-to-one guaranteed relationship. IT is not like a certificate of deposit where you can invest your money and get a guaranteed rate of return. Some companies are in the upper right quadrant there, have very high returns from their investments in IT. Other companies spend just as much and invest just as hard, but they actually have subpar returns, worse than the industry average. There's firms in all four quadrants. So clearly, IT by itself isn't the only thing that's driving productivity in these firms, and for that matter, we're controlling for the other measured inputs. The difference between the successful firms and the less successful firms is how they're using information technology. It's the complementary investments in the skills of the workforce, the organizational processes. And a lot of what we do at the MIT Center for Digital Business is try to understand and uncover those organizational changes, because what works today is very different than what worked 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and it's evolving. And so we need to uncover that. In fact, about 90% of the investment in computerization is not the hardware that's so visible. It's not even the software. It's these investments in skills and organizational processes. For instance, when somebody invests in a new ERP system, enterprise resource planning system, they might spend $20 million installing a new module. Of that, only $1 million typically goes to new hardware, $3 million to software, and all the rest goes to changing their business processes and training the workforce, or as economists call it, organizational capital and human capital. And that adds up to over $2 trillion if you count it over the U.S. economy, most of which doesn't show up anywhere in the official GDP statistics or in our government accounts. Furthermore, it's the interaction that really pays off. Here's a kind of a 3D plot we like to make at MIT, where you can look at not just IT capital, but also organizational changes, the digital organization. And what you see is it's the combination of the two that really leads to the highest impact on productivity and on market value. That if you do one without the other, you don't get very significant returns in the data. Now, as I mentioned, it's not just that IT is driving higher productivity and changes in organization, but also changing the way we innovate itself. And in particular, we're seeing 4 drivers of innovation being affected by IT. The ability to measure things in much more fine-grained detail, the ability to do quick experimentation, business experiments, share information, innovations, and data more widely, and replicate best practices through software and technology much more rapidly. So let me briefly touch on each of those. The measurement revolution, I would assert that most great scientific revolutions start with revolutions in measurement. For instance, this guy, Antoni van Leeuwenhoek, developed a better microscope, and as a result, biology and medicine have never been the same. He was able to see inside a drop of water and see the microbes swimming around there. Many of us would probably not be alive today if it weren't for that improved measurement and how it's changed those fields. Today, we're seeing a big data revolution that I think is every bit as important, affecting not biology, or maybe I should say not just biology and medicine, but really most of the rest of the economy, business, economics, government, the ability to measure what's happening inside of companies and between companies and with customers and suppliers in much more detail. We have gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes of data that we didn't have previously, and this has fundamentally transformed the way that I do my work as an economist, and that increasingly how managers make decisions. One thing we're seeing is a shift away from opinions towards using data. Ron Kahavi at Microsoft has the term hippos as the way that most decisions have been made historically in companies, and that is that you rely on the HIPPO, the highest paid person's opinion, to make a decision. But now we're substituting data, being actually able to measure what works and what doesn't work, and that's affecting many different industries. I won't go through each of these, but let me just touch the last one there, housing sales. We're able to use Google search data. There are about 100 billion, with a B, searches per month on Google. Many of them have to do with questions. Some people are looking for new houses, so they type in real estate or mortgage broker or other terms related to housing. And you can get data through Google Trends and Google Insights for search by geography and over time. What we found was that that was very predictive of subsequent housing sales and housing prices. And by just simply putting this data into the model, we were able to vastly outpredict all the standard economic models that were used by the Federal Reserve or the National Association of Realtors, not because we had a more sophisticated model, but just because we have hundreds of billions of searches that we can take a look at. And there are many other examples of that sort of thing where very fine-grained data doesn't lead to just a small improvement in your ability to make decisions, forecast, understand what's happening, but really just a fundamental transformation. And we've started measuring whether this is actually having a payoff for companies. What we've found is that the companies that are using more of these data-driven methods have about 4% higher productivity than their competitors, even after controlling for all the other inputs, including IT inputs. It's a different culture, a different kind of attitude. They also have significantly higher profitability and market value. Getting the data by itself is great, and you can find very strong correlations. But by itself, it's not enough to really sort out causality. Just because A and B are correlated with each other doesn't mean that A causes B or that even B causes A. To really get at that, what scientists do is they run controlled experiments. We're beginning to see the same thing happening among managers and executives in business. More and more of them are trained to use these experimental methods. And one good example of that, to pick a random web page from Amazon here, is that when they decide, for instance, how to design this page, where to put the shopping cart, they don't have a hippo, an expert, say, okay, I think that the optimal design is to have a little yellow box on the right. They run some controlled experiments, and it turns out that when they experimented, they found that putting the shopping cart, the click out there on the right instead of the left, led to about 0.1% more probability that people would follow through with the purchase. I don't know if you could have predicted that, but it was relatively easy to run controlled experiments to get that answer, and that, of course, accrued right to the bottom line. Similarly, we can share information more effectively. We've heard a bit about Wikipedia and the World Wide Web, but I think the most profound, interesting examples of sharing are what's happening inside of companies. So when I visited Cisco, they were describing to me a wiki they had set up internally that was saving them millions of dollars. Once they had created this platform, there were lots of ideas, tips, and tricks that people inside the company were sharing with each other. Simple things like how to use a printer, a Linux printer with Macintoshes. Not a profound scientific breakthrough, but if you add up thousands of these little innovations and share them throughout companies and between companies, you can have a first-order effect on productivity growth. And finally, the ability to replicate and scale things is also very important. Now, you can do that with bits. You can replicate bits on the internet. You can take a web page and copy it and use the insight you had in the shopping cart for one product and use it for another product. But you can also do it with business processes. And we're beginning to see the same thing as offline companies, not just web companies, are taking their business processes, embedding them in technology, and replicating them. For instance, at CVS, they have a business process for doing prescription drug ordering. The old process was very inefficient, had 27% of the prescriptions had some kind of a problem. The new process was much, much more effective, but the key was once they had developed this better process, they didn't just implement it in one store, they put it in their enterprise information technology and very quickly replicated it to 4,000 stores. So you multiplied the innovation. One store manager's insight became 4,000 times more effective because of information technology. Now, all of these improvements are important, and they're all being driven by improvements in networking information technology. And furthermore, they have synergies with each other. They amplify each other. However, they don't necessarily benefit everybody. And let me just close by saying there's some concerns in terms of how these benefits are being shared. The top line there shows that GDP per capita has been growing fairly steady. That's how much output we all have per person. But interestingly, and perhaps surprisingly, the bottom line shows that median income has not been growing. In fact, since the late 1990s, it hasn't really grown at all. It's a little bit lower than it used to be. Now, how can it be that GDP per capita is going up, but median income isn't? Well, it's statistics. That the GDP per capita reflects the total size of the pie, and as it turns out, over 60% of that growth has accrued to the top 1%. And that means that everyone else is not getting as much of a share of that economic growth, the trillions of dollars of wealth that have been created. The 50th percentile, the median worker, actually hasn't really gotten much benefit at all. And that reflects some powerful economic forces. It reflects the fact that, and I should say that the same thing's happening among companies as well. We're seeing some companies pulling away from other companies. The gap between leaders and laggards is becoming larger. And that reflects the fact that technology is creating a tremendous amount of wealth, but there are a lot of people whose jobs are being replaced as a result. So there are four main lessons here. The first is, or three main lessons. The first is that productivity surge is clearly linked to networking and information technology, and especially the organizational changes that have been enabled by it. The second is that we're seeing an improvement in the rate of innovation that's being driven by networking information technologies through measurement, experimentation, sharing, and replications. And the third thing is that our institutions, our skills, our organizations are not keeping up with these technological advances. And as a result, the pie is growing bigger, but not every slice is growing evenly, and the dispersion is getting greater than it was previously. So we discussed some of these things in the book that Bob mentioned, and I think I'm out of time, so I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Time for one or two quick questions. Let's see.
I'm interested in hearing a little more about the leaders and laggards, high IT, low IT, that you raced through at the end. What was the definition of high IT, low IT? That looked like a greater gap than I think the 4% you alluded to before.
Yes. Yeah, these are a whole set of different studies. The 4% had to do with companies that are using data-driven decision-making. The leaders and laggards, we took all the industries in the economy, we grouped into 62 categories, and we rated them by how IT-intensive they were, how much they were using networking and information technologies. And what we found was that the more IT-intensive firms had not just higher performance, but perhaps more interestingly, a bigger spread in performance. If you looked at the top quartile of firms versus the bottom quartile of firms, by definition, the top quartile is always doing a little bit better. That's how they're ranked. But the spread was relatively close in the 60s, got bigger in the 70s, and by the 90s, in the past decade, that spread's much larger than it's ever been on the record. So we're having more and more industries are becoming what we call winner-take-all markets. Joseph Schumpeter described this as creative destruction.
Take one more over here. This will have to be the last question, I'm afraid.
With respect to the growth in productivity attributable to IT,
right,
and with reference to the productivity paradox
yep.
of now ancient days, how do we measure that impact on productivity attributable to IT?
Well, it's a long question to answer that.
It's a short question with a long answer.
Yes, exactly. So I refer you to my webpage, which has a lot of papers that describe it in more detail. But briefly, what we try and do is we measure all the outputs and we measure all the inputs. And it's pretty easy to define. It's very hard to actually to measure all those. And a lot of the reason that I think the productivity paradox went away, part of it was that productivity growth grew, but also part of it was we were able to measure things in much more detail than before. And when Bob Solow made that famous comment in 1987, my Nobel Prize-winning colleague at MIT, we had relatively coarse measures. And today we have much more fine-grained measures. And we're able to measure performance in a way that we couldn't previously. So I think that's part of the answer.
And of course, it's the IT that has enabled us to get
those. Yes, exactly. The IT has created the improvement. It's also created the ability to measure things more carefully.
Thank you very much, Erik.